and welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to conversations with people who want to grow and spread empathy throughout the world.
Hi, so welcome to another conversation about empathy. I'm joined by Bushra Ebadi, who's a social innovator, researcher, and global strategist. She's committed to advancing peace, justice, equity, and the agency of marginalized individuals and communities globally through the co-design and development of inclusive governance systems, communities, and systems transformation. So thanks so much for joining me, Bushra.
Thank you for having me, Anita. It's really great to see you again.
Yeah, now I would love to just start right away by focusing on the word agency, because you don't believe in empowering people, you believe in offering agency, or not offering, maybe you'll even correct me on that word. Tell me more.
Yeah, so I think that the idea of empowerment has kind of, been around for a really long time, and that it entails really problematic notions or dynamics. So like this inequitable power dynamic of somebody giving somebody else power actually like perpetuates a lot of the problems that we see in society. So this idea of racism, oppression, a lot of that stems from these inequitable power dynamics and how they're used to really leverage like the ability to control or oppress people by making them feel like they don't have power, when in reality, there are actual systems in place to prevent people from exercising their agency. And so when I think about agency, it's more about people's ability to make decisions, to actually transform their lives, to act, essentially. And I think that's kind of been lost in the fray with a lot of the stuff that we've seen in international development, humanitarian work, the non-for-profit sector. Even if you look at the way that people are represented in these spaces, in the Canadian context specifically, I look at the non-for-profit sector and how many organizations claim to be working for African populations or South Central American populations, Caribbean populations, Asian populations, marginalized groups within our local communities. But when you look at the organizational structure, there aren't those individuals represented in leadership, for example. And when they think about diversity, for example, it's often white women who are the diversity that they've really conceptualized, and it's not representing the people who they should be working with, because I think solutions shouldn't be developed for people, they should be developed with people, and it should center the individuals who are supposed to be, impacted by the programs and the policies that are being developed. And I think that's been a huge problem when we use this idea of empowerment, because then it means that somebody has to come in and teach you how to do things, and somebody has to come in and give you the tools, and not recognize how they're also acting in systems and perpetuating systems, or being complacent and allowing those inequitable power dynamics to exist in the first place. And so we've seen kind of this transition of the narrative from one of even talking about racism to anti-racism. So it's not just enough to not be racist, you have to be actively anti-racist. And that also means that you have to center agency in the process. Because I find like even with the way that we communicate about things like poverty and war, it often is to elicit people feeling bad. And so these ideas of having sympathy for people instead of really empathy, because when you recognize that somebody else has as much power and, agency as you do, and that there are actual barriers that prevent them from exercising that agency, then you really tackle the systems that are at play instead of just these band-aid like solutions or interventions.
Yeah, this really resonates because it reminds me of this continuum that I use where pity is on one side, sympathy, compassion, and empathy. And pity does necessarily have a power differential embedded in the relationship. So you're saying when you're giving somebody, when you're empowering someone, it's almost, it is reaffirming that power differential. But when you recognize agency, that is sort of like you accept that that person, that animated life has the same God-given rights and deserves the dignity, and they have things that animate them just like you do, right? So there's a much deeper equality embedded in that relationship. I really love that. So I'm also really keen to chat with you about the work that you do to recognize the agency of youth. And the idea that there's a lot to learn from young people in the world today. And I wonder whether or not you would share a little about your thoughts on intergenerational relationships.
Yeah, so I think that with marginalized populations, and in particular, I've been working on youth engagement issues for the last, I would say, decade, probably longer than that. It's really about the fact that youth are systematically criminalized and infantilized. So they're both treated as criminals by systems. You can see this in how they're treated in public spaces. For example, like preventing young people from loitering, quote unquote, outside of like a grocery store, when really that like act of just being in a space is criminalized, which is really problematic. And then infantilized in that they're not really able to exercise their agency fully. It's always about reverting to the so-called adults in the room, even though the like age gap for, or like the age range for youth is 15 to 35, the most inclusive definition. So you do have people who are actually adults by the legal definition in many contexts and still unable to exercise their agency in meaningful ways. And I think it needs to move beyond just focusing on youth. I think intergenerational partnerships and dialogue are really critical. And how do we learn from each other? Because I think there's this notion, and again, it kind of fits into like the very colonial mentality, very racist mentalities of somebody who has a ton of experience and fancy titles being able to teach you things. But I think we can learn a lot from younger people and older people, really across generations. There's a lot of different lived experiences that can be leveraged, knowledge that can be leveraged. I think about how a lot of ancestral knowledge, indigenous knowledge has been, actively like lost. And I think there's been active suppression of that knowledge in our education systems. For example, the cultural genocide that occurs against marginalized populations. And so the passage or transmission of knowledge from generation to generation has actually been harmed in that process. And so it's about reclaiming that, indigenizing spaces. It's about anti-colonialism in the process of that. And so to bring people together in communities and really allow them to take part in this collective action is really important for me. And so I look at it from a systems lens. And so I use the idea of really looking at how do we intervene at a systems level, and then also champion individual agency and community agency as well. And so a few of the projects that I've been working on as of late have focused on, for example, media and information literacy, and how do we really recognize and value the knowledge of different communities. That includes youth, that includes elders, that includes Black, Indigenous, persons of color populations, women, gender and sexually diverse persons, people of different religions, ethnicities. So there's a wide range of people who are being systematically oppressed. And I think the power is in that collective. So bringing people together and helping them understand, their ability to actually make change happen because they're part of that system, but also recognizing that it's much bigger than any one individual. And so that's really important to me. And I think that intergenerational partnerships, along with intercultural partnerships and dialogue, for example, are really, really critical to move that forward. Because we can't do it in isolation. Like the systems that we're tackling are much larger, and they've been around for hundreds of years, and they've been put in place. So they're not natural systems that exist in our societies. They're ones that were created by people for the benefit of certain individuals who are in positions of authority, often white men, white European men, or people who are descendants of white European men benefit from that system. And it feeds into the capitalistic notions of exploiting labor, underpaying and undervaluing people's work and contributions to society. We see that in how women are not really paid for their work oftentimes, or not paid enough for their work. And even during COVID-19, the pandemic, we saw that they were immediately impacted in terms of job losses. So they were the first to be let go of. They're often the last to be hired in an organization. And this applies to other marginalized communities as well. And I love this notion that Kimberly Crenshaw has of intersectionality. So I apply that to a lot of the work that I do, is about looking at the different layers of people's marginalization and how systems are kind of acting on them in ways that really prevent them from exercising agency. So that's kind of like what I'm looking at. And I've been leading a campaign with some youth ambassadors from the Global Alliance for Partnerships on Media Information Literacy on making COVID-19 information accessible to different communities in different languages and formats, recognizing that people have different accessibility needs. For example, that information should be, as our right, accessible in the languages that we speak natively. I found that, for example, most of the information available online was in English, but you had many populations who were already being affected by the disease who were not able to understand that information. And so it's really difficult for people to then make the most informed decisions, and again, exercise their agency in the process of protecting themselves if they don't actually know what's happening, if they don't know what the best practices are, if it's not contextualized to their local setting or their lived realities, because social distancing to the 2 meters that's recommended, for example, is possible in some contexts and not possible in others. And so we have to be really mindful of that as we're moving forward. And I think young people play a really critical role in disseminating information, but they've also grown up, at least this generation, in a very digital space. And so it's about understanding how the digital environment also impacts our ability to understand and empathize with each other, for example, and also critically analyze the information that's available out there, because there is so much information out there and not all of it is credible. And even the people that we maybe have been taught to trust in society, people who have, again, those titles, who are in positions of authority. And I like to distinguish between positions of authority and positions of leadership, because I don't think that they're the same thing. And I find that we actually have problematic models of leadership or notions of leadership in place. And so it's moving and distinguishing from that idea of like somebody being in a position of authority and moving towards something that's more reflective of the type of leadership we need to see in our communities.
Yeah, a little more of a shared and distributed leadership. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think a shared distributed leadership, but also one that centers accountability. So being accountable to all the stakeholders and really making sure that you're not replicating hierarchies that have been in place for a really long time that really only benefit the people at the top in these situations, and don't actually look at, again, agency as being a critical core factor of community mobilization, how a lot of the effective interventions we've seen on any systems issue has happened through grassroots community mobilization, and to recognize that, and then to also recognize the leaders that we haven't necessarily even been taught about, right? So when I look at the types of leaders that I've seen historically reflected to me, they didn't actually look like me, they didn't have my background, and so it was really difficult for even myself to imagine myself in positions of leadership, because that leadership just looked like a cookie cutter. It was like a one size fits all for everybody, apparently. But that meant that people who are Black, Indigenous, persons of color, who are for myself, a child of refugees, an Afghan Canadian, were not reflected. And then there's also this notion of, if you have this one person who maybe has some level of connection to your identity. So maybe there's an Afghan person who's elected, which we did see in the Canadian context, but then there's this notion of tokenization. So you have one person and then everyone's like, well, it's done. Your community has been liberated. Everything is fine. We just need that one checkbox. And it's the same with how we've been engaging with youth and other marginalized communities as well. It's this idea of just checking a box and saying you have somebody in the room, or you have somebody participating in a conference or consultation, and that's sufficient in engagement, when that's not actually sufficient. And people don't even get paid for their labor, their ideas. So that's really important to me as well, really focusing on meaningful engagement and not just this idea of having people participate in systems in a passive way, because I think we're all shaping the systems, and the more we're conscious of our ability to really transform things and come together to make that transformation happen, I think the better we're able to create the type of world that we want to see, that centers justice and agency and equity and anti-racism and anti-oppression throughout everything that we do, really.
So, I've been teaching for, 15 years now. I adore young people because I find they're very spirited, bright, tenacious, capable group of people. So to me, you're speaking to the choir, but I wonder what you would say to people who are resistant to the idea of having young people join formal boards and be part of organizational leadership because they just don't have the experience. What would be your feedback to that?
I think it depends on what you count as experience. And sometimes we forget the lived experience is also really critical and important. And we assume that just based on somebody's age that they might not have a ton of experience. I do sit on boards, and I've been actually appointed or been elected by my peers, including people of different ages, to be sitting on these institutional boards. And it's reflective of the type of work that I do and my ability to mobilize communities and knowledge and resources to really advance the type of change that I want to see happening in the world. And so I don't think that it is just about having a set list of you need 10 years of experience to be sitting in this institution. I think you have to have an understanding of the way organizations work. And people come to that experience or expertise in different ways. So really following these traditional models of like, you have to go to a post-secondary education and finish, for example, university, and then go into a job starting at like maybe a certain rank and then moving your way up until you're therefore deemed to be qualified for executive positions or to sit on boards isn't actually meaningful. I've seen a lot of people who even sit on these boards not be effective in their roles. And so it isn't about having these fancy titles, again, about being in positions of authority. Like, you need to have a vision, a very strategic vision, and ability to bring people together to have that impact of transformational change. And so that's what I've seen be a problem in a lot of organizations, including corporations. And so there's been a push to make sure that inclusive governance happens. And there's a lot of research that's out there on how you need to have at least 3 people of like a different background or identity or experience represented in those spaces in order for you to have a critical mass to be able to speak up in those rooms. Otherwise, if you have like this one young person, for example, sitting on an executive board, it's not going to be as effective in making that change happen, because then everyone will perceive their interventions as just being because they're a young person. And we have so many intersectional parts of our identities. I'm not just a young person. I also have the lived experience of being a woman, a Muslim woman, of being Afghan Canadian. So there's all of these nuances to my experiences that I would like to see reflected. And I think that's the beauty of bringing in people with all these different backgrounds, is that you get to see things in different ways and understand the realities of the world that you're operating in. A lot of these organizations are interacting with young people. They're trying to engage young people, but then they don't want them to be in positions of leadership. Doesn't really make sense. There's like this dissonance between what they're trying to do in engaging their so-called stakeholders and then who's reflected in their leadership, because then it doesn't seem that they really value those people. It seems more of like a marketing tool in some cases, or trying to maximize your profits on the like labor and the wealth and experiences of a certain group, and not recognizing that they also should be reflected in those decision-making positions in the spaces that we're really shaping the organization and the way that it's engaging with communities.
Yeah, isn't there also sort of like a strategic case to be made around engaging youth, not tokenizing, the one youth on some board, but seeing sort of a critical mass of youth engaged because of the experiences, their lived experiences collectively as a generation. Given the urgency of fighting climate change, given the urgency of fighting systemic racism, like, isn't there something to be said about your generation's experience that is important for all organizations to pay attention to?
Exactly. And I don't think it's just relegated to any one generation. I know that climate change issues have been championed across generations and not necessarily recognized. Right now, what I've seen in like media, for example, is that there's this disproportionate recognition of white climate activists, for example, and not recognizing the Indigenous, persons of color, Black individuals who've been leading these movements for a really long time, who have been land defenders, who have been conservationists, who have been really doing this work for a really long time, and they haven't been centered in these conversations. And so then the narrative becomes one of like, well, how do we bring these people into the climate movement? And when in reality, they are a critical part of that movement. They've been leading, but they haven't been recognized and valued in that way. And it's the same thing with young people. So we've been part of these movements. We've been part of making these change happen because we do exist in society. So it doesn't make sense to just say like only the adults are like, so-called adults are, in society and are making a difference, when we're already all like interacting with each other. We're influencing each other's lives. There's young people, for example, who are starting organizations and companies who are developing technologies that are influencing people across generations. So it's not just relegated to young people. It's really important to then engage with each other across generations. Otherwise, you can have blind spots in the way that you're doing things. And so I think that's really an important step to making transformational change happen, so something that's more sustainable. If you don't engage with young people, then you also have the risk of not being able to continue these movements or the work that's being done, because now you've had this entire group of people who haven't been involved in the design of something from the outset, and then they don't have that sense of ownership over those ideas, programs, strategies. And so I think that's also something that's been missed in a lot of cases, and you've seen organizations then become obsolete in the process because they don't resonate with the different generations' realities and their experiences. And so it's not really in the interest of those organizations not to engage their diverse stakeholders, the people who will be leading the organizations or who should be leading the organizations even now.
Yeah. So on a personal level, just as a closing question, you've been working for years as an advocate, and advocacy work, activist work is hard and takes a lot of not only courage, but also tenacity in the long run, because you feel like you are by definition challenging the status quo, and that status quo wants to stay quo. So I just wonder whether or not in 2020, what you feel is heartening and what brings you optimism in your role, and what you still feel frustrated about, and that you want to just offer any listeners food for thought.
I think that we have this window of opportunity that's emerged, and it's come out of crises, essentially. It's come out of a lot of people suffering, unfortunately, which in my ideal world, that would not have been the case for us to really empathize with each other. And I think that the empathy is still lacking in many ways, and so that needs to be worked on. But when I talk about this window of opportunity, it's the fact that we have so many of these movements, like the climate justice and action movement, the racial justice movement, like health rights, our response to COVID-19, addressing poverty, kind of coming together in this moment of time in a very stark way that impacts a broader scope of people, and especially people who have been in positions of authority traditionally, or positions of power traditionally, are now being impacted as well. And so we've seen the way that people have cared about issues that were otherwise underfunded previously. For example, homelessness, like the fact that we were able to develop some sort of strategies, or even gender-based violence during COVID-19 in the Canadian context, for example, was a testament to kind of what I'm speaking to. And I think that's also revealing a problem, that we didn't necessarily care about these individuals who are homeless, for example, until certain people felt like there was a risk to them. And so it's moving away from this idea of seeing everybody as risks all the time, and risk management, which is a very corporatist strategy as well, I find, instead of having empathy and recognizing that everybody deserves to live with dignity. And I think we also lost some of the distractions that were in place that prevented us from connecting with each other. And so it was, I think, easier before to dismiss some of the experiences that marginalized communities were having, because you could just, turn to sporting events or different forms of art. And a lot of that has kind of been restricted because of COVID-19 and not being able to come together in the ways that we normally do. And we are very social beings in that manner. And so that's a critical part of us engaging with one another, but it's also caused us to not necessarily engage in ways that are meaningful, of really understanding each other, to recognize each other's agency and ability to transform the world, essentially, and the communities that we live in. So I think that really needs to be centered moving forward. But my hope is that now that people are recognizing it and understanding that it's not just a marginalized group problem. The reality is that we're all being impacted because we all exist in the system. And it's also kind of, for me, I feel sad that some people feel the need to oppress others. And so I think that's where we also need to steer the conversation, because sometimes we operate from a space of justifying why people deserve rights. I think that's how even LGBTQ or gender diverse people's rights have been framed as well. Oh, they're just like us. That's often the framing. And so you're debating people's humanity. And I don't think that should be the case. I think we need to move to a place to really ask the key questions of, why do you feel the need to oppress or belittle a population based on their identity? And what does that mean about you as an individual who's taking part in that oppression, who's actively preventing people, again, from exercising their agency, about really limiting their opportunities, and then victim blaming in the process, even shifting from a victim lens to survivors, because often even living in the system that is actively and systemically racist, for a lot of marginalized communities who have succeeded and been able to thrive in these systems, it's a feat in and of itself. And to really celebrate that, and to recognize how much harder it was to get to the positions that we're in right now, to still have a sense of community when everything in the system is kind of trying to separate us from one another, and the idea of divide and conquer, which is a very colonial strategy. It's a very capitalistic imperial strategy. It's how, oppressors are able to retain their power in the process of like marginalizing communities, because then they can justify like, oh, that group, is different than you and is less deserving of rights. And it's enabled them to enslave people, for example. It's enabled them to underpay people. And so we need to shift to a place where we actually come together collectively and recognize each other's humanity, have empathy for one another. And that's embedded in our systems. It's the way that we teach history as well. It's the way that we set up every system in our society. And to unpack that is going to take a lot of work. And so I have this idea that I think about, is that everything is difficult until it's done. So it's like when you're a little kid and you're learning how to walk, if you are able to walk, it's a difficult process. And sometimes people dismiss that experience and say, well, wouldn't life be great if you're 2 years old again and all you had to do was like, run around and play and just like eat? And I often think, well, as a young child, you're probably frustrated because you're learning how to communicate with people and you're learning how to use your motor skills and all these other things. And so for that individual, it is really frustrating, but it's difficult until it's done. And it's the same thing with like our work with anti-racism and the work of like liberating communities and centering their agency. It's going to be difficult until it's done. And so we have to accept that as being part of the process. And I think that's kind of the hope that I have for us to be more comfortable in this discomfort, to recognize that people have been uncomfortable for a really long time because they've been experiencing this marginalization, and that the process is going to be difficult. It's not an easy one, but when we lead with empathy, really people's agency, recognizing their inherent value, their inherent rights, that we can actually go a long way in making this world a better place.
Oh, I wish that for you. I just got goosebumps, Bushra. Thank you so much. This was a really fabulous conversation. Wish you a great day. Thanks for everyone who's listened and joined in.
Thank you so much.